tangata toku waka, ko parihaka toku maunga, ko hōtio toku awa, ko porowini toku marae, ko Ngāti Pakeha toku iwi, ko James Robinson. I've claimed porowini marae partly because Te Warihi Hitaraka did some of the carvings inside, and some of the toku panels relate to all the different religions of the world, the different cultures of the world. And since I don't have a marae, and I was welcome there, I'm using that from the time I lived in Whangarei. So, kia ora. Just when you need a technical expert, I have a retired professor of medieval studies and archaeology from the University of Macau. And
speaking Old Norse to me right now.
Yeah.
We almost have it under control.
Yes, if it's not going to work, we'll
don't
just
almost have it under control.
But we might just have to unplug it because this is where we went wrong. So,
can you go ahead and talk while I try to plug it in?
Yeah, sure. If you can do it. Otherwise, we'll just pull it out.
Do finger puppets.
We could pull it out and just no. That's just a power. That's just
okay.
Just pull that out and we can just put it on. It should go to the screen, shouldn't it? I think that's what stopped it going to the screen.
Oh, you think so? Okay,
Yeah.
all right, hang on. Let me unplug it for you.
Okay. So, just to give you some background, there was a program that was set up in 2017 through Ngāti Kuta Patukeha under the tikanga and mana of Matutera Tanana Clendon and others like Robert Willoughby. And slightly later, but he was always there, Manu Henare, Professor, thank you. And it was basically because Matu was interested in voyaging. He was interested in connections. He comes from Te Rāwhiti, and he's got Rakau Mangamanga as his mauna, and it's always talking about the Polynesian Triangle, talking about connections, and it was despite his connections through his hapu connections, he was looking from a Maori connection through to a Pacific connection. And it engaged with Andrew Blanchard from DOC and myself at Heritage New Zealand, because this is exactly what archaeology really is supposed to be doing. It's hei tangata, hei tangata, hei tangata. My esteemed colleague Richard Walter, who was weirdly was my contemporary at university and then went on to great things, and then he was my supervisor for my PhD, which must have been ultimately weird to have to do. I think not, but never mind. Has raised a number of issues about and in such a clear way explained what was going on at the time and what changed back in the Pacific. And so what we were looking at was that's cool. There we go. Yay.
Can you put this up? There you go.
It's good. Yes. If you remember the movie Flying High, whenever they plugged in the automatic flight control, the plane just started to crash. So apparently the mouse does that. Sorry, Richard, your mouse is fine. Our computer's stuffed. So this is the Mangahawea Bay, a site of early Polynesian settlement. So what we're talking about now is a place where those colonizing waka finally came to. Now, Richard and other of my colleagues here, Simon, are working on different islands. This happens to be an island in the Bay of Islands, and it happens to have some interesting korero history that when we pull together both the traditional knowledge and archaeology and some of the purest sciences, it comes together to tell some rather interesting stories. And when Richard was talking about how islands back in the Hawaii changed after the 1400, when the culture changed, something similar happened here. And we know it from a broad picture because as your tupuna first stepped ashore, they were East Polynesian. And they were starting a voyage in Aotearoa of becoming Māori, which continues to this day. So when we're looking at early sites, by default they are mostly Polynesian, and later sites are mostly what we consider Maori. Okay? So we're looking at what sort of early sites would we find if we come to Aotearoa. So everyone loves these slides. This is when this wānanga is talking about the link from Aotearoa back to the Hawaii, and then of course there were connections from Hawaii back to Samoa Tonga, and Dr. Ma was talking about the Austronesian language connections and all that sort of stuff. Archaeology talks about those connections from the point of the very earliest of humanity, our common humanity. So out of Africa and various places they moved and walked deliberately and all sorts of reasons like that. And then they got to the Pacific. And surprise, surprise, the Pacific was the last place to be settled. Possibly because it was rather hard to walk there, and it was a hell of a long way to go. And the islands are so small, on this scale you cannot even see them. So I won't go into any of that stuff which has been talked about before, but we'll get into this. So there is your classic story about settlement. It's been talked about before. There in the center of the blue is the Hawaii homeland, and some of those groups, one of those groups or groups came to Aotearoa. And as Richard mentioned earlier, it was quite obvious to Cook and Banks that these inhabitants of the Hawaiian Islands, New Zealand, the Society, Easter Island, the Marquesas, are undoubtedly of the same race. So it was quite perfectly obvious at that time. So let's talk about Aotearoa. What's special about it? I forgot my maths right, and I did get 26 in bursary maths, so I possibly am wrong. About 10 times the size of the rest of the islands put together. Either way, it's pretty big. It has reliable rainfall for horticulture. It has year-round rivers. It's got good soils, at least in places, and wide range of lithic material for stone tools, unlike some of those small atolls that Richard was mentioning. Numerous large safe harbours and sloping sandy beaches for landing canoes. One of the fundamental differences, it's subtropical to subarctic conditions. This means that horticulture, which is a fundamental basis of Polynesian societies, can only really be grown in the north. And it did have a fundamental change on which crops were actually chosen. So the questions are, where did the early East Polynesian settlements occur around Aotearoa? And we know it was pretty much everywhere, and pretty much as fast as we can record. We can't differentiate by time where they were. They were moving around, they were continuing that model of interaction and moving stuff around. And in those early days, we can't differentiate them. I've always sort of felt that at that time, it's a very good insurance policy. You have small, isolated communities, small numbers of people, maybe several hundred kilometres apart. Having that cultural interconnection provides you not only with that emergency fallback insurance scheme in case something goes severely wrong, as it did on a number of the Waka voyages coming to New Zealand, but it also allows you for the necessity of marrying outside your group because it probably wasn't big enough. And those things were well known on islands. So where did they occur? Everywhere. How can we recognize them? Because they have this early Polynesian signature of material culture. And what was their nature? And Richard has talked about that. He's talked about this nucleated. These Polynesian villages were sort of clustered together. This is not what you see in the archaeology of the late classic Māori period. Your rohe is quite wide. You go here, you go there. You got all this sort of stuff. So I'm looking at how did they change over time. So I'm bringing it back to what we call the Bay of Islands. But as you see, we go up to Takao. We haven't missed that out, that area, so that's good. And we're down to Whangaruru down the coast. But that's the zone there. It's a very benign area. And when we look at early Polynesian settlement in the area, we've got Murphy Shortland's map here. Murphy's promised not to heckle me today. This was a collected knowledge of traditional names that was published in 1995. And although it's very hard to see at this scale, this is the area we're particularly interested in, and particularly that Matu's interested in. And it focuses on the island of Moturua, the second largest island in the bay after Urapukapuka. And there you see, there is Moturua, with to the bottom left is Motu Arohia, and that's where, in terms of more recent history, that's where Cook was anchored. And some of the interesting things from the names that Murphy was able to collect was you get some common names like hikurangi, and Ross Ramsey mentioned 40 of them around New Zealand. That's an ancient name. And then Matu, in his pipiha, mentions the Motu Rangiatia. Rangiatia is an interesting name. Let's just call them up. So it's, and there we go, getting there, nearly there. So we've got clearly got language connections. These names turn up all over the place. Language connections between Hawaii, Rapa Nui, Aotearoa, and East Pacific. So hikurangi is found in the Pacific. It's a mountain on Mehetia as well that was mentioned the other day, and upwards of 40 places around the country. Motu Rangiatia connects to the name of Raiatea. It's termed as a local place name, both in Rarotonga and elsewhere in Hawaii and in other parts of the Pacific. It's a common ancestral name, and this is what happened when you come to places, you use names, and some of them survive. The Bay of Islands has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of archaeological sites. It's a wonderful place to live. It's got pockets of good soil. It's got great fisheries. It's sheltered. If you're going to transport by canoe, it's a great place to be. And so a lot of the early sites are overwritten by later sites because it's a great place to live. If it's a good place in the early days, it's a great place later. So just looking at some of the sites that have a signature of early settlement, some of that signature is things like moa and seal. We know from Professor Ian Smith's work on seals and their early extinction. Oh, sorry, not too many. And so moa and seal became extinct early in the settlement period. Moa were not used to predators. They bred every 2 years or more. They, if you think of them as ostriches, an ostrich is a racehorse and a moa is a cart horse. You could probably run one down if you were 65, I think. So the point was they were easily exterminated. So the fact when you find them in a cooked, hungy environment, you must be in an early phase. It's not a difficult argument. So the one at the top there was is at Wairua, where Dr. Simon Best found some moa bone. Manawara, down at where Murphy used to live, was where a cache of what we call archaic or early adzes, and because the adze types change over time in Aotearoa. And Dr. Simon Best did a seminal paper on this change, which is attached in the book Change Over Time, and it's recognised as one of those key papers. But I'm particularly interested in the islands of Moturua, and there we have it. So, Moturua Island. Mangahawea Bay on the top left is the bay of particular interest to the Arakite Charitable Trust. And there's the little dot there that you can see, and that was a midden, a rubbish dump that was recorded by Dr. Phil Moore, who's a geologist, back in 1980. And he noted that it had an underlying layer of bone, but he talked about a particular shell species called Solana denticulata. That's the Cook Strait limpet. What's interesting to us is that normally Cook Strait limpet's found in Cook Strait. What a surprise. It did have an extension into the Bay of Islands, but it became extinct quite early. So like moa and seal, Solana denticulata in a cooked environment, like a hungy or a river, means early, to some extent early. So we know something's early going on there. But this island's got a history that goes all the way through the human settlement of Aotearoa. Down here you can see the bays of Waiti and Waipau. When Lieutenant Cook and Joseph Banks and Tupaia arrived in 1769, they went there for water to the bay. That's the one on the right, Waipau. And when Marion Dufresne arrived 3 years later, he went there as well. He got water there, but he also set up a camp, a hospital, and various other things in Waiti Bay. After the death of Marion, his men went from that camp at Waiti Bay and crossed over to Pairua Pa. And the French attacked the Pa. It's the only one, I believe, the only traditional Pa site designed for handheld fighting that was attacked by people with guns, and it was actually recorded as well. And that korero turns up throughout Whakapapa in the bay. But let's go back to Mangahawea Bay, because that's the focus of this, this research, and it led to the Mangahawea Bay project. And there you can see the insert, and where the arrow is where the midden was. 1981, the Bay of Islands was, DOC hasn't been formed. It was the Bay of Islands Maritime and Historic Park, which was set up under the Lands and Survey Department. And one of the archaeologists who worked for that department was Jan Mackay. She saw the site record that Phil Moore had left and went to carry out an investigation there. When you, bunch of young archaeologists, Dr. Shepherd here, and I think he was still Mr. then, Dave and Mike and John Costa and John Mitchell. I know all of those, which makes me officially an old fart, I think. But they went there and they found on this beach, they did a little section along here and they dug these holes. And a number of interesting material artifacts came up, which were consistent with what Richard talked about in terms of the fish hooks and stuff like that for an early settlement. So it was like, oh, it's looking pretty good. So for example, you can see the things like the little tabs here and shell fish hooks, bone fish hooks. Tabs are interesting, we'll talk about that later. And a strange pendant, which we'll talk about later as well. Didn't seem to be fitting in with what we understand for a classic Māori society in terms of artifacts. Seemed to be more Polynesian in origin, so it's looking like this was an archaic or an early site. Archaic was referred to in those days. And there's the Silana denticulata. It's basically a limpet. It's got a lot of meat in it. It was very tasty, I'm told. And this was the section that they drew up. And you can see with the red arrows, there's the zone of Polynesian occupation, worked moa bone and shell. And you can actually see this little cut here. When we talked to Matu about that, he said, well, that's what we did. We cut into there to make for the kumara to be stored in the ground, in the sandy ground. And you place them and you cover them up and you come in from the side to pull the kumara out. So that's a later thing that's come down from up here. So this is Archaeology 101. This is stratigraphy. What's at the bottom is old, what's at the top is young. But that feature cuts down through it, so you then have to interpret it. Kia ora. So in 2017, something happened. And what happened was that Jan Mackay, who was the director of that excavation in 81, had passed away. Made about 5 different attempts to write up that excavation, and every time it failed. And the material culture ended up back with the Department of Conservation as the land manager. And he talked to John Booth, and to Matu, and it was like, this is important stuff. These are important artifacts. Something needs to be done. One of the big no-nos in archaeology is you dig a site and you don't write it up. It's ethically unacceptable. And it's happened on too many of the really important sites, you know. It's like, so we won't even get into that. So we went back to try and relocate the site. And there we go, having a lot of fun in the sun, under the tikanga of Matu. There's that's the re-excavation of I think it's Area 1 that was dug by John Costa back in 1981. He turned up and dug as well in 2017. Mike also turned up, and as did Dave, but John Costa was the only one who could still fit into his Lands and Survey overalls. The others had sort of, how can we put it, had gained gravitas over the succeeding years. So we did relocate and we completed the excavation. And what you can see here, this is there is the red line is where that section drawing that I showed you came from 1981. We've lost about 1 metre and we did a section drawing through here. And we found something pretty significant in here. So in here, you can actually see there's the cultural horizon of the part of the early site where the cooking's going on, and then it drops down into here. This is a big stone-lined hangi. There's my section drawing of it. You can see it, there's the cultural horizon, and then it cuts down into here. Now, it is lined with large stones, and it does contain a small amount of moa and seal bone. This is quite different from the sort of material that Richard was finding in the Wairau Bar, where the hangi, when they were, all the material was thrown back in after the feed, full of bone. These ones weren't, but it was the same era. And it's the same size. It's about 5 metres long, which is a pretty large hangi. And don't get too hung up on stones in the bottom of hangi lining it. When you're digging hangis into sand, everyone will tell you have to put some stones down or the heat just disappears and all the food's half cooked and your name's mud. So as John O'Hare told me up at California only last year. So anyway, but this is an important find. This is if they're cooking moa, it's early. How early? Well, we'll get into that. 2019, we were thinking in 2018 we still had questions. The best you could hope for in an excavation is to answer some of the questions, but always raise more. And we were trying to understand if this was an early settlement site, it's going to be one of those nucleated sites. Where is the village? We think we've found where the dogs were being kept together. We think we've found the hangi and the other general cooking zone, but we couldn't see the village. Had it already become a modern Māori village with things going on in different places? Not really sure. So we were thinking about coming back, and we were working out ways and means to pull money together for it, and then the Tuia 250 came up. And so the Arakite Trust, chaired by Matu Clendon, and the other trustees, Robert Willoughby and Professor Manuka Hinari, decided to go for some of this funding to do more. And so and we put in a bid was supported by Department of Conservation, Heritage New Zealand and the University of Otago. And the bid was put in under the heading of Arakite Charitable Trust, not by any of those other organisations. And that trust is set up, you need a trust to do that, but it represents Ngāti Kuta Patukea, right? So the haikanga. And so we decided to do a lot more. And we ended up doing an excavation in January, which found a bit, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Then this wānanga was one of the things that came up. Another of the projects that's being funded is for a po to be carved, reconnecting Māori as a group to their Pacific tupuna, that high-level thing, which can only happen because Matu traces his descent through both Ngāpuhi and Ngāre Rāmati, so he and his close connection with the island, he can take that high view. And I acknowledge that. So we got into some pretty good science. In my era, people got into archaeology because we were absolutely, technical term, shit at numbers. But ended up doing complex three-dimensional mapping, which just shows there's a God and she's got a sense of humour. But needless to say, this is an area where we did what was called geophysical studies, if you watch your Time team on television. And this is a magnetometer, and it measures differences in the magnetic field, which can occur when you have things like post holes or hangis turning up in the ground. And we did it in these areas. So this is the bay. We ran a LiDAR survey, which is a laser survey, basically to get a 20 centimetre contour. Bounce lasers off. Why do we use lasers rather than light? Because that's all covered in bush. The lasers go to some extent through the bush. So you can we've actually peeled off the vegetation that's there at the moment. So, and we found some areas that we thought meant something. Now, this is a more top-down view. So what we're finding is there's a lot of stuff, a lot of what they call anomalies, a lot of hits were turning up down here. And this is where the 1981 and the 2017 excavation was going on. And we decided to investigate this area of interest compared to when you come back into here where there was much less going on. Doesn't mean there's nothing there, it just means that system was finding it out. So what we did was areas 1, 2, 3, and 4 that we did. So 2 inside the zone and 2 outside. So that's an overview of the top. That's the red circle shows the area that we did our investigations on. So it comes through to there. So go and that one. So, and we're trying to confirm activity areas. We're using photogrammetry. I don't need to get into that for this talk. But essentially, we were finding that this is area 1 is not shown here, but area 2, below my red line, lots of hungy and stuff going on, sequences of it that relate to the later occupation of the bay. Here, this is all gardening zones, as up here. And this one's particularly interesting because of the connection to Taro. Now, we've talked about early artifacts. And these ones came up yesterday. These are the two that were mentioned as being definitively from the Pacific. They are exotic or not native to New Zealand. And there's the pearl shell lure from Tairua and the craniolated auger from Wairau. So looking at these, we're doing some research this is the two sides of that pendant lure. It was analysed by Dr. Kat Zabo, who's a specialist in those things. She calls it a pākahawai. This is that flashy bit that goes onto the wooden hook to attract those fish. What's interesting is it seems to have multiple lives. As you can see, it's got attachment knobs or lobes at the bottom. That one's missing. Mike Taylor knocked that off when he dug it. He admitted it to me. Despite much searching, they couldn't find it. It was a bit too small. But then they've got the drilled holes as well. Now, in terms of a functional thing, you drill holes and have lugs in the same place, and the whole thing's very much weaker. And so there was a working hypothesis that this might be started as a pākahawai and then maybe ended up as a pendant of some sort, to have different functional use. The species that this shell came from, we thought, is this a Pacific exotic species? Doesn't appear to be. This appears to be, Kat Zabo thought it was a silver power. John Booth got hold of some silver power for us, and it's clearly a power, but the curvature's too gentle for that. It's more in the size of your standard power. Okay? So here you've got something that is apparently Polynesian, and we can't find any evidence of this style anywhere else in later Māori New Zealand. So this is a Pacific design on a New Zealand shell. So it's early adaptation. Some of this is a bit of a long bow to draw, but it's a working hypothesis. This is a process of work, and the point is to test and check. And we're using traditional knowledge as part of that process. So these are some of the things that you find inside. There are, to the top left and center, you've got shell fish hooks, classic fish hooks, and fishing lures. And on the right-hand side, you can see two fragments of one-piece bone fish hooks, which we think are made from moa bone. It's either seal or moa. As you can see, they're broken, and that's what happens. Stuff gets thrown away if it's broken. It's rare to find stuff thrown away that's intact. Down at the bottom, you can see these little fragments of something. Now, if you remember Richard's slide, he's got something like this, absolutely the same. It's the same design, okay? And this is part of a bone fish hook as well. So the artifacts are quite clearly fishing related. This is a tab. When you make a bone fish hook, you get something like the scapula of a seal or something, and you scribe out the fish hook, just like people hang around their necks today. And sometimes the point really closes up, and you think, oh, that's just stylistic to make it look pretty. But no, it actually works quite well. And so you scribe it out, and then you drill the outside, pop it out, and then you drill the inside of there, and you pop that out. This little thing here is the pop out of the inside of a fish hook. Just a bit of rubbish, isn't it? But the point is, what it tells us, people were manufacturing fish hooks here. It wasn't just a fishing camp where you went to do something. So we're getting a hint about something that's going on. The thing that was found in 2019 is some later period artifacts or artifacts that we don't know their period. This is a tattooing chisel. Right? When Joseph Banks came onto this island, it was unclear whether it was Motu Arahia or Moturua. He was taken where somebody was being inked up, and he said, these tattoo chisels in Aotearoa are identical to the ones back in the Pacific. So these are items that have continued through the period of human occupation in New Zealand. And these are different from the moko carving. These are your classic tattooing, which continued side by side. So this is in really good nick. You can see the little teeth at the bottom. The other thing that John found, he's always finding stuff, is this, you can see it's a PowerShell eye. You can see them on a contemporary carving. It's exactly the same. Could be late, could be middle phase, could be early, don't really know. Definitely we've got a continuity of occupation. And some of the features that we're finding, these are, there's where the hanging is behind Hans over there. This was the bit that was excavated, re-excavated in 1981. And here's these food storage pits at the bottom. So we're dealing with horticulture. This is area 3. What we were finding here was that there was an original buried stream, and it might well have been buried later in the occupation sequence to make everything into the historic gardens that Māori were growing, particularly for white potato, which was engaging with the whaling fleets back in the 1820s and 30s. These little sticks here, they were little pockets of charcoal, which we are working on the assumption that this might be a taro garden. This orange colour you can see here is due to the high water content and what had been the side of the stream. As everyone knows, taro likes getting its feet wet, kumara does not. If these are gardening, we will be getting that dated and hopefully identified by Rod Wallace and see if we can make some sense out of that. So Alex, you were finding taro on Ahuahu, and it appears to be one of these early things. Taro is still grown in the north, but kumara becomes the dominant crop in Aotearoa. If you go to Mangahawea, as I went with Richard many years ago, they'll tell you about kumara. It's pig food. They don't eat, you know, because it came in late. Taro's got much higher carb loading, all that sort of stuff, and they love the taste. And Manayan taro is supposed to be as tasty as, is it Nauru is the other one? That's and Richard was telling me that you used to get shiploads of taro coming into Auckland, and the Cook Islanders would descend upon it, and then what was left would head down to Wellington, and then the islanders there would descend upon it, and what left ended up in Dunedin, where there was a large Cook Island population, and they got the scraps, and they weren't very pleased about it, I'll tell you that. So this is a work in progress. This is what a modern taro system looked like, a little bit low ones in Punakea and stuff like that. It is irrigated, and this one's from the Pacific. So let's talk about Mangahawea Bay. It's an early Polynesian settlement, absolutely. Worked tools indicate it's more than a temporary camp. How much more, I don't know. Geophysical analysis identifies occupation along the frontage. We haven't yet found the nucleated village, if there was one, right? Confirmed gardens, possible taro, definitely later extensive historic gardens. And when I say extensive, basically the whole bay has been converted into a garden. In that era of the gunfighter musket wars, where you were growing white potato to buy muskets, it was an essential requirement for survival. This is what happened. The area was, it was also the little, one of those other little islands offshore. Motuoi was the last battle for Ngāti Ramati. So this has been in Māori occupation all the way through. What I haven't mentioned to you is that there are historic artefacts, including gun flints and bottles, which show this continuity of occupation. In other parts of the world, finding a stratigraphy that goes from early to late is quite common. But for Māori, because of the dispersed settlement and reuse in different places, finding one site where you find all this through is unusual. So the Mangahawea is important to archaeologists because we can see it all in one place. It's one of a number of sites in the bay. The dating from the Hangi is clearly 1300 AD. It's as early as anywhere in New Zealand with all the AMS dates we did. The large earth oven Hangi contained cooked moa bones, equals early occupation. It's ongoing. And the gardens, especially the taro, appears to early Polynesian style production, overlated by later. So we haven't found any artifacts, heirlooms that came on a waka across the Pacific that we found, like the tairua or the shell adze. Everyone wants one of those, you know, it'll be just pretty stunning. But that pākahuai seems to be stylistically unique. We can't find another one. There are later ones, but they're radically different. So we've got something that's early. How early? They're adapting, but it could be within the first 20 years. Definitely within the first 100 years. This is an early site. And so it's early phase cultural adaptation. We've still got more questions. We're still trying to understand it. We're still doing the analysis. So work in progress. This is a drawing by Crystal Wolfe. We had an artist on site. We tried to feed her as much information as we went. This is from the hills looking down into the bay. You can actually see the hangi there. See the waka pulled up. There's Moturangiati at the back and Motuoi at the front. They look like one, but they're actually two separate islands. And we've got the gardens sort of showing around here. This whole concept has changed slightly since we first talked about it, but it gives, especially the kids, something to grab hold of, that this is something that was going on. And this is the work in progress. Now, as I said to Matu the other day, every time he tells me that he's the caretaker who cleans the toilets, I will tell everyone that he is an officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit. And you can see here, this was run under Māori tikanga when John and Mike and Dave came back in 2017, which was a good 37 years after the first excavation. They were so pleased to have it under tikanga protocols. It allowed them to end what they did, because back in those days you didn't do that stuff, you know? And they came back and they offered everything that they could. And then when we did our excavation in 2019, again, under protocols that Matu's mana and tikanga, and the protocols that Kipper Munro and Andrew have been working hard to inculcate through the whole processes in this lovely part of the world, are going on. And I would make the point that we had 15 archaeologists working on this site from the University of Auckland and Otago and various other places, the chairperson of the New Zealand Archaeological Association. They weren't students, they were pros, and they were having a masterclass in what was happening with archaeology. And because of the tikanga, there was 5 of them who were only going to stay for the first week, and they basically either lied to their bosses or quit or blackmailed their bosses, and they stayed for the second week. And John Costa, who couldn't be with us here today, and can be a prickly customer, said the Wairua of it was just first class. And we don't take credit for that, we just really enjoy being part of that process. So I'd just like to acknowledge, as you can see, George is there's Sam, and lots of people. But it could not have happened without the tikanga. So, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou koutou. Kia ora.
Kia ora, James. Ngā mihi, because I think many people are now going to board a boat and maybe on Sunday have a look at some of the digs that will be happening around the Haukainga. So I want to say thank you for your presentation this morning and seeing te matua tēnā koe, te matu ngā mihi kia koe. Nāu I krakia, I āmene rātou, kia heri a koutou rā o te kāinga nei, ka mihi atu. I'm just acknowledging the tikanga side of it, that I think that made, and you mentioned this to me some time back, that it made it more real and comfortable that you were under a tikanga that allowed you to do that. Other digs can not go with tikanga and sometimes can go wrong. And so I want to acknowledge you for that, James, and tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. I don't know if we have any questions, but I'd like to maybe one question, because we want to have on to the next.
Okay, small one. Just a quick comment. In Para Garden had that red or red brown. Not so much waterlogged, it's more oxidised, but the water table may well have fluctuated to give a combination of hydration and oxidation, but it's not single. That red brown zone, that is the key factor. Just a minor.
Kia ora, Ross. No. Thank you, Ross. Cheers for that. Okay.
Nā reira, homai e mō rā te whakitaki mō tēnei.
I'm sitting there listening to it, and I want to talk about Martin's father, Henry. Yeah. Yeah, most of my history comes from Matthew's family. And Matthew's sister's husband, Sam Mangahawea. Now why I say that is that Matthew's father had a dig. He allowed the dig to go on in Opunapa, over the hill. And I think he passed away when they did the dig, 60, I'm not too sure. 8, you know, they would have been there. And their research showed that the Maoris were there in the 10th century. In Mangahawea, where I live, we've found answers where we've had, what's her name? Tuna.
Yeah,
Mary Tuna do a paper for me, and she passed in this way 800 years old. She said that they were the oldest answers that she'd ever seen. They look like the ones that I showed, first ones. I remember in the Russell Museum. And also, Monica, I noticed you mentioned Sir James's name. Sir James was named after Henry's father, and he used to spend a lot of time out there. And Henry had a heck of a lot of knowledge. So I just want to acknowledge that.